This is my hot take on the new Tag Heuer Carrera Porsche Chrono Special Edition. Overall, I'll cut to the chase. I think this is a perfectly acceptable watch. It probably didn't deserve the hype that Tag Heuer tried to give this release. There's a little bit of echoes of the AP Code 1159 perhaps around that misplaced hype. But I also think, like the 1159, in some people's kind of annoyance at the overhyping, they've kind of lost sight of how important the Code 1159 was and will be to AP moving forward, and how important this tie-up between Tag Heuer and Porsche is going to be moving forward. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit on the other side of the intro. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and as I've already told you, this is my hot take on the Tag Heuer Carrera Porsche Chronograph Special Edition. As I've said already, I think this watch is okay. It's a new version of the generally well-received Carrera that was released in 2020. It's got a modern sporty case with sapphire steel, ceramic, in all the places you'd expect it to be in 2021. The movement, the Carrera, the Heuer 02 movement, is a perfectly good modern 21st century movement. All the right buzzwords: automatic, column wheel, 80 hours power reserve. Where it's been reviewed in places like Watch Time and the blog to watch in other watches, this movement has been pretty well received. If you dive down into the detail with things like the dial, Tag Heuer, have clearly tried to capture and reinforce these automotive themes. You know, that dial that looks a bit like asphalt. For me, it also looks a bit like a Formula One tire. But, you know, whether it's the dial texturing, whether it was the selection of having applied minutes as opposed to hours, which I think was a smart move. It really ties in this kind of sporting chronograph racing kind of motif. Just the color choices, the color palettes are all really solid. The fonts apparently for the numerals apparently replicate what you see on a Porsche dashboard. Personally, I don't see it, but Porsche is making that claim, so maybe I'm just looking at the wrong pictures. But anyway, all in all, what I would say is it's a good, solid watch. There's really nothing too much wrong with it. Now, some people don't like the fact that it's branded with another car company at all. Some people think that it should have been way more than that. This is kind of a no-win situation, I think, for all watch brands. My personal opinion is subtle. A little bit of subtle co-branding with some carryover of nameplates and things is fine. You don't want to get too carried away. You don't want to lean on it too much. And you do want to sort of keep the authenticity of what the brand, the car brand in this case, how it would represent itself. And I quite like just that tiny little kind of Porsche on the bezel. It doesn't yell and scream. It is there. It is in the kind of look and feel that you would get from a Porsche nameplate on one of their cars. I actually don't mind it, but I think watch companies, whenever they're doing these, are kind of in a no-win situation. For every person who likes it, there's going to be someone who wanted more or less. Overall, I think this is not terrible. So if the watch is okay and not terrible and generally, acceptable, why would I bother doing a hot take on it? Well, the truth is that Tag Heuer is a big brand. We see it everywhere, but you can't deny that it's a brand that's got some serious image issues within the watch collecting community. And I think that this watch is important because it can help Tag get past that. But I'll talk about how that's going to work, or how I think this works moving forward. So what are the problems that Tag has in our minds? I think the first is, for a long time, they were producing, frankly, some pretty dodgy fashion watch adjacent watches with unspectacular movements, not great finishing, a bunch of probably cheap parts, and we were overwhelmingly underwhelmed with what they produced. I think there's a sense within the community that they've taken over and perhaps even kind of sullied the Heuer name and not taken advantage, rather than trying to take the best bits of Heuer and incorporate it into Tag Heuer. They've instead just leaned on it and tried to milk it for cheap and easy cash. Take those two things in together, and I think that's where Tag Heuer's problems in the enthusiast market are. And I think this watch, and in particular with its formal and enduring tie-up with Porsche, the Porsche business, the company, the actual Porsche, can work on some of those problems, whilst at the same time keeping Tag watches and keeping this watch as mall friendly and as generally accessible as that brand needs to be. And that's how I think that something I should say up front. We tend to downplay that. We tend to lose sight of the fact that we get to enjoy watches because someone's making a bunch of money selling them to a bunch of people that aren't us. Tag gets to make all its watches not because of us, but because people walk into shops in malls and buy the watches as well. So this watch, I think, first off, does that job pretty well. The Porsche tie-up, the general look, it's going to sell okay. It's going to be popular. That's good. That's a necessary condition for all Tag Heuer watches. Having done that, though, why does it do anything for us? Why does it make us as hobbyists feel better? I think the first thing is it's got to meet these minimum requirements, and it does that. It is a good solid watch with good solid movements that kind of makes sense, that's well designed, etc., etc. Now, this is not unusual. There's a couple of watches from Tag Heuer. I'll be very careful how I phrase that, which already do this. The Octavia chronographs, very popular, very well respected within this community, and generally quite liked. The later versions of the Monaco, the same. There are people like Jory at the Time Teller who doesn't like Tag, but will say that a modern Monaco is something that he would take. The last year's Carrera, again, another version of a watch that people really like. Now, the problem with all of those is, yes, they do create a backlog, a momentum of Tag Heuer watches that kind of enthusiasts can get behind. But the problem is all of those are very Heuer watches. In some ways, they actually make the problem worse, because whenever anyone looks at those watches, they say, yes, that is true, they're decent watches, and all it proves is that the only decent things coming out of Tag Heuer is anything that's really associated with Heuer. None of those watches really do a great job of bringing Tag to the party and showing that Tag and Tag Heuer should be the brand we respect and the brand we desire. And that's where I think this watch is different to those others, because this watch really brings Tag and Heuer together. See, Heuer's got the long racing history. They bring their history with the Carrera, and they bring a lot of informal and ephemeral relationships to Porsche. And that's important. You remember earlier I spoke about this new tie-up is formal and enduring. The Heuer tie-ups with Porsche in the past have not been that. They've rarely been, if ever, I think, tie-ups with the Porsche company. Instead, it's more like one-off sponsorships of Porsche drivers, or one-off sponsorships of Porsche teams, or perhaps tie-ups with Porsche dealers. But I'm not aware of Heuer ever having any kind of official relationship with the Porsche company. That's where Tag comes in, because Tag does. Tag has very deep, real, and very official relationships with the Porsche company. This all started with the co-developed Tag Porsche turbo engines that went into those F1 cars in the McLarens in the mid-80s. They won 3 world championships with 2 different drivers. They were plastered all over the place. And that's Tag. Tag has brought that relationship with Porsche. Following that initial tie-up with Tag and Porsche in those McLarens in the mid-80s, you then had Tag Heuer having formal relationships with Porsche around the Carrera Cup, the Super Cup competitions, and with Porsche in the Endurance World Championships. Then, again, more recently, I think it was around about 2019, Tag Heuer has had a formal relationship with Porsche in their new Formula E team. And if, as rumoured, Porsche comes back to Formula One in 2022, you can bet your bottom dollar Tag Heuer will be there as a formal co-branding partner. So I think this watch, even if you don't particularly like the design of this watch, even if this watch isn't particularly motivating you to go out and spend a lot of money, is still worth thinking about and still worth kind of paying attention to, because this watch brings together the Tag part and the Heuer part of Tag Heuer over their shared history with Porsche, each bringing something about that relationship and potentially forging a new path forward. I can see it's not going to make any difference to people like Jory and Jody and all the other people who've been doing YouTube for 10 years. We've made our minds up. We are probably not going to change our opinions on Tag because of this watch or the watch that comes after it, or even the watch that comes after that. But this is a tie-up which I can see running for many, many years. That isn't really necessarily aimed at us, but it's rather aimed at the people who are coming into the watch community now and maybe in 2 years' time or 5 years' time. They don't necessarily have the baggage that we're trying to get past. Instead, what they're going to see is a Tag Heuer which has deep relationships with Porsche, a Tag Heuer which has a very keen design language and very keen idea of what it wants to be moving forward, and a Tag Heuer that has joined its Tag and Heuer histories. And I think this watch will be the point that all of that comes together and moves forward. So, like I said, even though this watch in itself is good, solid, workmanlike, it's respectable, it's quite decent, that's all it really needs to be. I think that it is those things, and it can set Tag Heuer up for moving forward is more than enough. The last thing before I go is there has been some discussion about why would Porsche go into this arrangement with Tag Heuer when in some ways they have their own watch company. Porsche Design does build some watches. They do make a couple of nice ones. But I think you can see a couple of reasons. One, that is kind of eating your own money. If they do want to get some money from outside, it's got to come from an outside company, and Tag Heuer will give you that in a way that your own Porsche Design won't. And the second thing is, I think that Porsche Design watches can be incredibly hit and miss. Yes, there are some nice ones. They did a world timer a couple of years ago that I quite liked. But take an example. Look at the one they've just released that you get if you're only allowed to buy if you actually also buy a new Porsche. It's pretty uninspiring. I mean, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's boring. And I can see why that's probably an aesthetic that Porsche Design can't get away from because it is kind of who they are. But if you want to be more than dull, then Porsche, the car side, really has no choice than to go to someone other than Porsche Design for its watches. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think this tie-up has happened from the Porsche end rather than the Tag end. Okay, so that's it. That's my hot take on this watch. The watch is perfectly okay, but it's not really about the watch. It's more about what this relationship means moving forward and why I think this could actually be quite important in the future. What are your thoughts? Do you hate the watch? Do you think it's okay? Do you agree with me that this could be where Tag and Heuer come together, or do you think that this is never going to happen and that the long-term solution for Tag is to simply excise itself from the partnership and just call all its watches Heuers? I'm interested in what you think. Put your comments down below.